A nation can survive its fools, and even the ambitious, but it cannot survive treason from within.
They've been wrong about the wars. They've been wrong about jobs. They've been wrong about everything. The question is, are they stupid or do they have a plan? I actually think for the most part, they have a plan, but some are not too smart.
Welcome to the Horrible, Deplorable Show, the anti-globalist, America First program dedicated to dehoaxing the media and destroying the narrative. Here's your host, the founder and editor of the Daily Stir, Matt Wingard.
Welcome to the Horrible, Deplorable Show. My name is Matt Wingard, and with me, as always, is my good friend Doris. Hello, Doris.
Hello, Matt.
I want to welcome the Gab community who is listening to us, and remind you that you can always find this and past episodes of the Horrible, Deplorable Show on iTunes, SoundCloud, Stitcher, Pocket Cast. You can go to thedailystir.com, our website, or you can see it on YouTube, hear it on YouTube. And also we play on the405media.com, weekdays at 11 a.m. and weekends at 5 p.m., the405media.com. And when you use your favorite app to find the show, just search for The Horrible, Deplorable Show. It is the last week of 2017, and I thought that we would go over some of President Trump's accomplishments. I'm not going to actually do the grading that I promised until next month because I want to give him the full year to be graded, he and his cabinet members. But we are just a few weeks away from the 1-year anniversary of him being sworn in, and he has quite a list of accomplishments. On the jobs and the economy, he's passed the tax reform bill, $5.5 billion in cuts, and although I'll mention it again, that repealed the Obamacare mandate. He also has increased the GDP to above 3%. We're actually on our way probably to 4%, which is miraculous. I mean, something that he felt very strongly that he could do, and that the Obama administration spent 8 years claiming was no longer possible. Created 1.7 million new jobs, 159,000 of those in the manufacturing industry, 57,000 of those in mining and logging. He's cut unemployment to 4.1%, black unemployment at a 17-year low, and Hispanic unemployment at an all-time low. Record high stock market that has added $5 trillion in wealth to the U.S. economy, and a rebound in economic confidence to a 17-year high. I think when it comes to the economy, those are pretty extraordinary accomplishments, and a lot of that has to do with the market anticipating the tax cuts that were eventually delivered, and then with our next subject, the job-killing regulations that they have cut, and he's done a pretty massive job on the regulation end. Signed an executive order requiring that 2 regulations be repealed for every one that is created, and he has way surpassed that goal, actually cutting 16 rules for every regulation that's been created, saving $8.1 billion so far, and all of that includes 15 congressional regulatory cuts as well. And he's also withdrawn the U.S. from the Paris Climate Agreement.
So on the tax cuts, the Democrats are favored to say that it's all for big business and there's absolutely nothing for the middle-class American or poor people. But isn't the change in withholding tables going to make a difference for everyone that works?
Oh, yeah. I think most Americans will see anywhere from a few $100s to a couple of $1,000s in tax cuts in the ensuing year or two. So a lot of that is going to come as once the withholding tables change, likely in February, people will see a slightly less take from the government, more in their paycheck. But again, and we've talked about this before, the main purpose of those tax cuts was to get the corporate rate down. He didn't get it to between 15 and 20, he got it to 21%, but down from something like 35, 32%, very, very high, one of the highest, if not the highest in the industrialized world. And there's all that money that he wanted to have that was parked overseas that he wanted to have repatriated. That's all going to be coming back. I noticed that Apple announced that they would be bringing back a large chunk of money. That money gets plowed back into the economy. It's going to take a year or two to completely manifest itself, but all of that money coming back and being invested in the United States economy and the tax cuts that keep, one of the things people won't ever really be able to quantify is the corporations that didn't leave, because this has been an ongoing process of American corporations merging with foreign corporations, relocating their headquarters outside the United States. And with this tax cut, with the corporate rate coming down, I think that process will slow to a trickle. And so there are all these companies probably over the next few years that would have relocated outside the United States that just aren't going to do that now. And then that, like I said, that probably won't get quantified. But I think the boost to the economy that this tax cut and the regulation cutting combined are doing is in some ways not calculable. I mean, things that would have been lost that aren't lost are probably the main aspect of what won't get calculated. But there's going to be a tremendous amount of economic activity that occurs now and job creation. And it'll be important to give all of that to, all the credit to Trump for all of that when it happens. So a lot of people are going to find that wages increase or that they have better job prospects. They're able to leave a job they don't like and find a better job. All of that as a result of the work that Trump and his team have done in just 1 year. On healthcare, he has, like I said, ended the Obamacare mandate, which is kind of the heart of the bill, because without the requirement that people get the insurance, that probably will cause prices within the Obamacare system to continue to increase. Now, he has, I don't think, accomplished as much as he's promised on healthcare. We don't have the ability to buy insurance across state lines, and they're still talking about bailing out the insurance companies, something that was going on under Obamacare, and the president has currently said that he won't do anymore, but Congress is talking about sticking those payments into one of these budget bills. It's going to get debated in January, so we'll have to keep our eye on that, and then that could be part of the end of the year report card. On the issue of trade, he made good on his promise to withdraw from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and he has been working to bring U.S. companies back into the United States, including companies like Toyota, Mazda, Broadcom Limited, and Foxconn, not all American companies, but they've announced plans to open U.S. plants. And he ended Obama's deal with Cuba. The main thing that hasn't been done is that NAFTA has not been renegotiated.
What was the deal with Cuba?
Obama had opened up and started the process of ending the embargo with Cuba and allowed tourist travel and the rest.
And how did he end that?
Well, they've simply announced that they're not going to go forward with those steps that had been outlined, and they're rolling back parts that had already been done. So I don't think we've seen the full manifestation of that. It's just partly words at this point, but there's certainly no intention to thaw relationships with Cuba as there was under the Obama administration. Another significant set of accomplishments falls under the category of boosting United States energy dominance. The Department of Interior has led the way in cutting regulations and opened up 77 million acres in the Gulf of Mexico for oil and gas drilling. The president expanded infrastructure projects like the Keystone Pipeline. That includes the Dakota Access Pipeline as well. He ordered the Environmental Protection Agency to kill Obama's Clean Power Plan. The EPA is reconsidering Obama's rules on methane emissions. The tax cut bill has opened ANWR for Arctic drilling, something that Republicans have been promising to do for 25 years and now has been done. And he rolled back 2 national monuments in Utah. I think that's a big story. I'm going to talk about it a little bit later, but our continuing and growing independence from the rest of the world for energy is a huge, huge game changer politically. I would say under this category, the president has done very, very well. Protecting the U.S. homeland. He ended the Obama-era catch and release of illegal immigrants. He's boosted the arrest of illegals inside the United States, but in my mind, it's not enough. Doubled the number of counties participating with ICE and charging and deporting illegals. Removed 36% more criminal gang members than in fiscal 2016, and added around 100 new immigration judges. At this point, though, the wall has not been started. Deportation numbers are nowhere near where they need to be, and he hasn't cracked down on sanctuary cities yet in any way that we can see or that's causing anyone to cry uncle. I think that's a very mixed bag. Trump has nominated 73 federal judges and won the nomination of Neil Gorsuch to the Supreme Court. He's also gotten 12 appeals court judges approved, and that's a record. And he did create some new rules, basically a lobbying ban for people that work in his administration once they leave. Under the issue of abortion, in his first week, he reinstated and expanded the Mexico City policy that blocks about $9 billion in foreign aid being used for abortions. And they have attempted to block Obamacare money from supporting abortion. Under the category of veterans, he signed the Veterans Accountability and Whistleblower Protection Act that allows senior officials in the Department of Veterans Affairs to fire failing employees, and it established safeguards to protect whistleblowers. He also connected the Department of Defense and the VA computer systems. What we haven't really seen yet, and because I think it's a little too soon, are the kind of rubrics, the numbers that would show us that there's real change in the VA. Things like the suicide number, the unemployment rate, and the homelessness rate. And as those come in after the end of the first fiscal year, we'll have a chance to better gauge the impact of a lot of the legislation that's been done around veterans. On the defense side and international relations, he has increased defense spending, withdrew from the UN Global Compact on Migration, which was a threat to our borders. He imposed a travel ban, which the liberals tried to stop with their activist judges, but the Supreme Court has backed him on his right to issue that travel ban. Saw ISIS lose virtually all of its territory, and he has gotten NATO members to increase their dues. Significantly, though, while there's been a lot of heat and rhetoric around North Korea, and he has continued our presence in Afghanistan, we haven't actually seen any success in North Korea yet, and our presence in Afghanistan has not been wrapped up. So those are issues that are left on the table after year one. Some of the things that the White House has counted as accomplishments that I agree. Trump won the release of Americans held abroad. He's done that in a number of cases, often using his personal relationships with world leaders. He made good on a promise to recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, and I suspect the U.S. Embassy will follow in short order. And he has stood up in the culture fight for things like the national anthem, Christmas, and Western civilization, and for that he deserves high praise. Overall, I think it's a pretty impressive list of accomplishments. Those of you who follow me know that immigration is my number one issue, though, and unfortunately that one I think is pretty light. So when we get to grading, it's going to be hard to give him an A because we haven't seen enough movement on immigration. But certainly on a host of these other issues, he has quite a list of accomplishments. The only other one that I would say is, I guess the other two categories that needs improvement would be some of our foreign deployments that need to be brought to a close, and around the healthcare issue. He hasn't made as much progress on that as I think we need to see eventually. But still, an impressive list. Doris, your thoughts?
Well, I agree with you on the healthcare issue. There's no insurance yet across state lines, and I don't think a healthcare plan will be successful until that happens. So that's number one. I agree with you all the work that he did on energy dominance. But I wish that he would roll back some timberlands in Oregon away from federal ownership. Things I think were most successful to me were his containment of ISIS and restoring confidence in America with standing up for the national anthem, saying Merry Christmas, respecting Christmas, and what he did with naming Jerusalem as the capital. I thought those things were all wonderful.
Which leads us into the discussion about what's coming in January. There are nefarious and dark figures negotiating as we speak to come to some agreement on a DACA deal. And I have said this before and I'll say it again. I think an attractive deal is extremely unlikely. A deal will probably come forward, but it will not be a deal that we would want to embrace. And so I believe we need to prepare ourselves to fight this back and make it clear that this is a red line for the president that he can't cross with his base of supporters. Now, if I was negotiating the deal, what I'd be looking for is a deal that ends chain migration, ends anchor babies, creates a mandatory E-Verify program, and caps legal immigration at $500,000 a year. And the way I might go into the negotiations is to take a look at the entire universe of these so-called dreamers. Probably draw a line somewhere around the 1 million to $1.5 million mark, and then break up that whole group, whether it's $1 million or $1.5 million, into 2 or 3 subgroups, maybe an initial $500,000 and then 2 second sets of $250,000, say, for instance, if it were $1 million total. And that core group would be the ones that would have, I would want any kind of a life preserver program to be focused only on the best, those that have gotten college degrees, that are contributing members of society, that kind of thing. No criminal records, all the rest. And you take that list of things, serving in the military, getting a college degree, things like that, and you put the bulk of them on that first list, that 500,000 that you're going to cap at, and then the last few rubrics maybe you place on those other 2 groups of 250,000. And so I walk into the negotiation essentially with a willingness to give life preservers to some DACA, and then but not all at once. An initial group, and then a second and third group. And then I bring out my list of asks, the things that I was just talking about: ending chain migration, ending anchor babies, mandatory E-Verify, and legal immigration capped on an annual basis at 500,000. And I basically say, I want everything for the 500,000 life preservers. And, at the end of the day, when the negotiations are done, I probably haven't gotten everything on my list in exchange for the 500,000, but that's why I held back the other amounts. And it allows you to come back at this apple and bite it 1 or 2 more times, ultimately get everything in exchange for allowing the total amount still capped at, say, 1 million DACA recipients all at once. Now, that's I think the right way to negotiate. Make sure that at the end of the day you walk away with everything. Or if you're not quite able to walk away with everything, that you haven't given away the DACA issue entirely, because as I've said before, I think it's the only real leverage you have. And those stories and the political pressure that those people in the DACA program put on Democrats to make a deal is important. And again, always have to be prepared to walk away. And I think Republicans are not negotiating good faith because they don't agree with us totally on this issue. But the point is our side actually has the stronger hand, because the president has the ability to keep deporting. So if you don't want a deal, if you don't want to make a horse trade, some life preservers for a radical change in our immigration system, then we'll just keep deporting. And that way the negotiations can remain open, but it's the deporting that puts the pressure on the other side to buckle and to agree to a deal, even a deal that maybe they're not that happy with. And that's, again, going back to my point about the president not deporting fast enough. I actually think the numbers need to be ratcheted up, because that's part of how you continue to put the political pressure on the Democrats.
I think you should send a letter to the president suggesting how he should do DACA, Matt.
Yeah, they're just waiting there at the mail house, I'm sure, for my letter to come. But I do think that it's worth making the point again that the president needs to get deportation levels up. The more the squealing and the squawking and the angst on the other side about deportations, the more they're motivated to come and sit down and make a deal that radically changes the immigration system in exchange for some life preservers. I noticed the other day that Orrin Hatch was taking a pounding from the local paper there in Utah, the Tribune. Now, Orrin Hatch is pure politician. I mean, 100% politician. You don't become the longest serving Republican in history without being basically a convictionless automaton who moves like a shark wherever you need to go on any issue in order to stay viable and to continue to win re-election. So I have no illusions about Orrin Hatch, but let's be very clear that when the Tribune, which just excoriated him over the holidays, basically claiming that he lied about the fact that would be his last term, shocking, folks, and that he's been blocking future generations of talent by standing in the way. Please, the Tribune doesn't care about future generations of talent, especially since that would, be one conservative after another, which I'm sure they're not happy to see. The issue is, because there's only one person that will replace Orrin Hatch if he retires, and that's Mitt Romney. And everybody in Utah knows it. And the president wants Orrin Hatch to stay, and it looks like Orrin wants to stay, and he's been buttering the president up in public ceremonies, just lavishing him with praise. And do I believe that? I've been very clear about who I think Orrin Hatch is, but he seems to understand better than a lot of never-Trumpers where his bread is buttered and that the Republican Party has shifted, and like a wily politician, he has moved in that direction in order to stay viable, which are all very smart, and I understand why he's doing that. I would love to see Orrin Hatch replaced in the U.S. Senate, but knowing that the only replacement sitting in the wings right now in Utah is Mitt Romney, and knowing that that is what the Tribune wants, is Mitt Romney in there, not some future generations that are being blocked from getting into the Senate. Believe me, Mitt Romney is not the future. I am a strong supporter of Orrin Hatch in this particular circumstance, and I would like to see Orrin announce his re-election and hold on to the seat because he is a lot more reliable than Mitt Romney. I have concerns about what's going on in Utah and the fact that there's a strong never-Trump base in Utah, and I hope that the Trumpers in Utah will take care of some business there because it's really just crazy that there should be such resistance to Trump among the folks in Utah. I say it's better to have a spineless weasel who votes right than any never-Trumper like Mitt Romney. I've spoken about the U.S. military budget before, and when we were going through the list of accomplishments, I piqued my interest. I want to come back to this. I've come a long way on military issues and foreign intervention over the last 15 years, and I've spoken about this on the podcast, and this has been part of my evolution towards Trump nationalism and away from the neocons and those folks who have proceeded to involve us in perpetual war with just ever more lame excuses for why that must continue. I personally believe that we have to reduce the defense budget. We have significant deficit and debt problems. And while I want to see a lot of other things in the government cut, ultimately the defense budget cannot continue to increase. And any kind of trajectory that a lot of the hawks like McCain want in the budget, it just isn't going to be enough money to maintain the military in the size and scope that it is. And that's why we're in a position now where we have so many planes and tanks and ships that are outmoded or continuing to be patched together, and they, the fleets, these various fleets need to be replaced. But they're all just too big. It's just too much. The mission is too large. And I've talked about this before, but I'm going to say it again, that the only way to get the budget down is to reduce the scope of the United States mission. Right now, the mission as it's constituted isn't funded fully, and that's why we have problems and we're not able to take care of our veterans, and soldier pay probably isn't where it needs to be, and equipment is not being replaced. But rather than acceding to these neocon wishes to increase the budget in order to meet the mission, in my mind, the solution is to reduce the scope of the mission so that the current budget, or even a slightly reduced budget, is more than enough money to be able to replace equipment and to pay the soldiers. And yes, that means coming down in the number of people that are currently enrolled in the military, and it does mean closing down bases, and it means pulling out of places like the Mideast. And I'm going to talk about our energy independence, which is a key element to our being able to do all of this. But in my mind, there's an opportunity here, as if we are focused on adjusting the United States mission, to also kill a bunch of other birds with the same stone. I know there's a lot of consternation out there about the UN, which is basically a useless organization and that we pump money into and a lot of time and energy. The UN does serve a purpose, though, that I think ultimately needs to be replaced. And one of the suggestion that I have in creating an alternative coalition is one where we have a bit more control. We ought to basically move away from NATO over time. That was constructed as a front-facing organization towards the Warsaw Pact and the Soviet Union. That doesn't even exist anymore. And NATO is just too constrained by its old mission and its old focus, and it's basically a bunch of countries in Europe. That's not the coalition we need to be building. We need to think about a new NATO that is more international in scope and not Europe-focused. And this would be an organization that we could be a dominant member of, but that we can invite other countries that we trust into forming basically an international organization that can keep the peace and that can try to intervene occasionally in international problems when they become genocides and those kinds of things, but that we can also cost share with. So in my mind, we would basically create a military that we are funding about half of and that our international partners are funding the other half of. And we would recruit soldiers from the United States, but also from these other countries, giving their men access to the proud U.S. military tradition, the benefits, the prestige, and all of that, which, by the way, has the added benefit because the military is a very masculine entity, and I think one of the things that has reduced the amount of feminization that has occurred in the United States versus, say, our European allies and other places where they have virtually no military defense funding is there isn't that outlet for their men to go into the military and to get that training and that sense of honor and prestige and protecting their homeland that I think kind of rings primal bells for men. And I don't think it's a surprise that as we've seen some of these countries reduce their militaries, especially in Europe, their men have become far more feminine, far less masculine than in our own country. Now, it's not like it's not a problem we're dealing with as well, but I like as a side benefit that the partners that we have involved have the ability to give their young men the opportunity to be involved in a military that is involved in actual action. If it isn't humanitarian action, it may occasionally be, warfare of some kind or another, and they can test their mettle and learn basically a lot of those kinds of skills and bring that back into their own, that strong sense of masculinity back into their own societies. It also creates strong social and economic links because countries that fight together tend to bond, and there'll be a lot of exchange. I mean, if you think about as this goes on for years and years, the men who've served together will visit each other in each other's countries, will know each other's families. It creates strong ties between the countries that are in these kinds of organizations. And I also think when you create an organization like this, you can lure over time other countries away from this anti-democratic globalism and into your own organization. It may start with 10 countries, but it can grow to include other countries over time, just as NATO has, when they sort of meet certain conditions and they are attracted to what you stand for, they move in your direction politically and economically, you can bring them in over time. So who am I thinking about? I'm thinking about countries that are strong defenders of Western civilization and or have a strong independent streak and are anti-globalist. In my mind, the kind of countries that could form with the United States some kind of an alternative to NATO is the UK, Australia, India, Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary, that are the three countries currently resisting a lot of the globalism in Europe. Japan, Chile, down in South America, perhaps even Israel, and Botswana, which I've just come to learn a little bit about, and which the United States military is already talking about creating a base there. Botswana is one of the more successful, or one of the only successful countries in Africa, and has one of the highest per capita incomes on the continent. So, again, I'm just giving you the very light outlines of an idea of creating an alternative to NATO that gives us a presence on every continent on the globe, allows us to cost share, and to create a kind of a husk of an anti-globalist alliance that can help us accomplish a bunch of goals, including reducing our own military expenses, forging better alliances with key countries around the world, encouraging them and their societies to remain strong and vigilant, and I believe over time actually reducing the power of globalism, because I think a strong organization like that over time will pull in other members who are willing to make key changes in order to become a part of that alliance. Doris, your thoughts?
Well, first of all, I think we're paying about 22% of the UN's budget. And I don't know how many billions of dollars that is, but so you would just sort of pull away some of that money to form this new coalition.
Yeah, and eventually phase us entirely out of the UN.
So what is actually the difference between the UN and NATO?
Well, the UN is all of the countries of the world, and NATO is just the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. So it's all of these European countries that banded together to, which is extremely dominated by the United States. We provide the bulk of the equipment and the soldiers for, and it was created as an opposition to the Warsaw Pact, which was all the Soviet satellite countries. So it's a relic of the Cold War, and everything about it is designed to face east and to stop a Soviet tank invasion, essentially. And it's tried to take on issues like terrorism now, but it's again, it's just a bunch of countries in Europe, so it doesn't really have the kind of tentacles or reach that you would want an anti-terrorist organization to have.
Okay, so I understand their mission. So then what is the mission of the UN and what do they accomplish?
Well, they would tell you their mission is to maintain peace in the world and to offer a place for dialogue. This is a lot of the complaints that were made about the League of Nations and why the United States didn't join have turned out to essentially be fairly true criticisms of the UN. It is just a debating society. It's not necessarily clear that it's ever really provided a forum that's avoided war or conflict anywhere. And it does become kind of this island of elites who draw large salaries and pretend to be busy doing a lot of things and don't. Now, the UN has accomplished a few things more on the humanitarian side, things like UNICEF, where they have done organized airlifts for food and saved people from starvation, and they've also done a lot of vaccinations and things like that. Basically, third world medical treatment kind of stuff. But I'm not convinced that that wouldn't have happened or couldn't have happened if the UN didn't exist.
So really it's NATO that you would be replacing with this new organization.
Yeah, but it's also a chance to move away, again, because it's an international alliance. It's an opportunity to move away from the UN. I don't think we would probably ever withdraw as a member, but we might, essentially end all of our funding for it, which would reduce the UN greatly because it depends on our funding.
Then they wouldn't be able to build these expensive buildings in their countries for the UN, would they?
Probably, and they might even move the headquarters out of New York. But I think if we have our own alliance that's actually doing a lot of the on-the-ground work in the world and intervention wherever that's necessary, and so the UN then really is just a debating club that we're not even funding, and they've moved the headquarters somewhere else, I don't think it really matters. It becomes fairly neutered and a pretty insignificant entity at that point. And this alliance, whatever name we give it, will be powerful enough and will be involved in the world enough that basically everyone will be responding to it, taking an opposition stance or trying to be a neutral party or attempting to join it in one way or another. It will create its own gravitational pull that everything geopolitically will revolve around.
Well, that would be interesting. Have you got a clever name for this new group?
No, haven't spent a moment thinking about that.
Maybe in the future you can give me a name.
I'm sure something will come to mind. So what were the most significant events of 2017? I was putting a list together over the last couple of weeks, and I got to 9. Maybe I'll think about a 10th, but for now, this is my list of the 9 most significant events of 2017. Number 1 is obviously President Donald Trump's first year in office. He is the most consequential president in our lifetime, perhaps the most consequential president in history. And he has done a whole bunch of things, including defeating ISIS and passing the tax cuts and pulling out of the Paris Accord. If you think about all of the work that Scott Pruitt at the EPA has done and that other agencies have done to reduce regulations, there's just that fantastic picture. For me, it's almost the picture of the year. They created a great visual where they stacked up all these papers. I'm not sure if they were at the White House or where they were for the photo op, and then they had this small stack of papers and this giant stack of papers and a red ribbon in between, and the president was making the point about how many regulations he'd cut. And it was just a great visual for them on this issue of, as we've said, 16-1, they've been cutting regulations. And it's just a one-off. I noticed, the press, they don't always catch everything. Just as a one-off in that press conference, he said that in his mind, he wants to cut regulations all the way back to 1964. And I waited for the press to erupt over that and to talk about Rachel Carson and Silent Spring and what a hellhole the United States was environmentally back in the 60s. But they all seem to let that line from the president go. I didn't see any hair pulling. So it's always selective outrage anyway.
Instead of Person of the Year being the feminists, they should have had that showing the difference in the regulations.
Yeah, except that's Time Magazine, currently run by a bunch of liberals, and there's no way they're going to celebrate or think kindly on what that all symbolizes anyway. Interestingly, though, when you mention the Time Magazine, the Koch brothers have just acquired Time Magazine. And so I expect that over the next few years, Time's going, the editor and the people who run it are going to be replaced. And the Koch brothers are basically libertarians. And so while that's not exactly in line with Henry Luce, the guy who founded Time magazine, who was a staunch anti-communist and a conservative, I still think that Time magazine will be returning to its roots, and I expect the editorial bent and the news coverage to become a lot more conservative in nature, which, you know, the liberals are all going to talk about basically Time becoming the next Fox News, but at the end of the day, Time magazine was a very conservative magazine for a long time, very staunchly anti-communist, and I have been surprised to see how liberal it has gotten, and it often makes me think of Henry Luce and what he would have thought about his flagship magazine becoming basically a Mother Jones or a The Nation. And so I'm pleased to see that the Koch brothers have purchased it. I don't know whether a magazine can really survive in today's media environment, but it's such an important brand, Time magazine, that it will be nice to see them take it back onto the conservative side of the divide. Getting back to the president and the most significant event of the year, his reclaiming of the federal judiciary, the fact that conservatives finally have a culture warrior who's providing leadership, all of this, everything that President Trump has done is the most significant story of 2017. Number 2 is the growing Department of Justice and FBI scandal. The media has really tried to downplay this, but it is apparent that a number, and we're up to maybe 8 to 10 members of the Department of Justice and FBI, and we're talking about the highest ranking members of these two departments, were involved in a lot of shenanigans during the election last year, either trying to help Hillary Clinton by tamping down her email scandal or by investigating, and it may turn out actually eavesdropping on the Trump campaign, using that phony dossier to get a FISA warrant. We're going to see if that's going to get proved here in 2018. But this is explosive, how politicized the DOJ and the FBI were and are. And it looks like almost, at least 6 of these people have been demoted or fired or left the FBI and the DOJ in the last year. And I think this scandal is just getting started. And it's going to develop further in 2018. And we only really became fully aware, or maybe the magnitude of it only became visible in the last couple of months of this year, 2017. But it is still the second most significant event of 2017. Number 3 is America's growing energy independence. And I spoke about this earlier, but some of this is Trump and some of this is just where things have been going. The whole fracking revolution and the shale revolution in the United States has uncovered natural gas reserves that could last the United States 1,000 years. And part of what happened to us in the 70s and 80s around OPEC and we are very dependent on oil and fossil fuels, was that the balance of power, or at least the need for that energy, pushed us from a foreign policy stance into the Middle East because we had to maintain these supply lines of fossil fuels. And as we've become more and more energy independent, and I believe that by the time the president's 2 terms are done, the United States will be fully and entirely energy independent, a net exporter of energy to other countries. The implications of that are enormous. This essentially eliminates our need to be involved in the Middle East in any way, shape, or form. Now, Israel and powerful Jewish interests in the United States continue to pull us in that direction for their reasons, but without the strong economic need, you are going to see the United States pull out of the Mideast almost entirely over the next decade because we just don't need to be there. It's just not as critical to our economy as it once was. And the fact that that can reduce pressure on our military budget, the fact that that just reduces violent conflict in the Mideast on our part, these are huge, huge benefits to the United States. Then the fact that we are producing and consuming our own energy is such an enormous boost to our own economy, because we are not sending dollars outside the United States to purchase energy. They stay here within our own economy, and that we can export this energy and bring money into the United States as a result of that. This is huge. It cannot be overstated how significant this is for the United States economy going forward. And while it doesn't get a tremendous amount of press attention because it's one of those things like, I guess it's kind of like the internet or the invention of television or something, that the effect is slow and gradual over time, and it takes a decade or two before people realize what a monumental impact something like that is having. This growing energy independence is doing the same thing.
So won't we be spending less money overseas, just giving money to countries to buy this or that from them?
As far as when it comes, what's been motivated from an energy standpoint, yes. Now, you can never underestimate the inertia and, established things like people like to refer to the military-industrial complex. But this just gets at a kind of a known reality, which is that once people have established jobs doing something, especially people in elite positions, they tend to find excuses to maintain their job. In a previous podcast, I talked about part of the animosity that's maintained towards Russia is the fact that we have so many people who are trained Russophiles, people who've spent their entire careers in the Cold War making the argument and, that we need to have an oppositional stand to the Soviet Union, that when the Cold War ends, they all still want to be employed, at the State Department and in D.C. and at think tanks and the rest. And so you have to find new reasons to hate the Russians, a language they've all learned. In other words, think about all the time and energy they put into being Russia experts. And if suddenly we basically just don't need Russia experts because the world's turning in a different direction, well, a lot of elite people are going to find ways to make sure that we keep our attention on Russia so that they can continue to matter and be relevant. And you face that same prospect here. Think of all the people who have trained, who have studied the languages of the Mideast and who have studied the cultures of the Mideast and, are chock-a-block throughout our State Department apparatus and our think tank apparatus because we said we needed those people. And we spent, millions, hundreds of millions of dollars training those people to be experts in the Mideast. You can't just pivot away from the Mideast and say suddenly to all these people, we don't need you anymore, and not expect them to, because they're very bright people, to try to find clever ways to keep us engaged in the Mideast so that they can remain relevant. So the answer to your question is the need will not be there, in all honesty, but we have to be very diligent about
phasing it out.
Right, and doing that with intention, because there'll be a lot of people who dream up lots of reasons why we should not. Number 4, the Me Too hysteria definitely is the fourth biggest story of 2017. Now, we've talked a lot about this on this podcast and the fact that this is just an enraged mob. You're taking a handful of cases in which men were very aggressive and were essentially raping women, and that gets conflated into toxic masculinity and every aspect of male-female courtship being villainized, and the idea that men are too aggressive and that they don't take no for an answer and women are taken advantage of. And we've talked about this before. Some of these stories have involved a dialogue in women's heads that they were not sharing with the person they're telling the story about now, the person they're accusing, and not taking any responsibility as an adult for their own choices in life. But this mob formed. I identified it as a mob very early on, and one of the more delightful things about it, not that I'm a fan of mobs, anybody who's listened to me knows how much I detest them, but watching so many liberals who helped to stoke and create this mob get devoured by it has it's in the world of karma, it's fairly rewarding, but it's still a pretty toxic movement. And it's definitely very anti-male. And it's hard to make an argument that it's very pro-female with the sort of standards and excuses that it's been promulgating for the last few months. This is not a movement that remotely resembles the kind of feminism that fought for women to be in the workplace, that fights for the kick-ass woman that you see in movies all the time and that frankly I've grown tired of. But this idea of the strong independent woman who can hold her own and fight for her own rights and knows her own body and her own will, that's not really what we're seeing in this Me Too movement that has cast women as little Red Riding Hoods moving throughout the forest, being preyed upon by wild wolves at every turn. Where that's going to go, I don't know that it's burned itself out yet. And I think some of this is rage over Trump. This Trump derangement syndrome is going to take on a number of manifestations, and I don't think we've seen all of them yet. Liberals are unhinged by the fact that Republicans and conservatives have found a fighter for the first time basically in American history, they have found a populist and a fighter and somebody who slugs as hard as he gets slugged from the left. And he's winning. And that has created complete meltdowns on the left. And a lot of people who I think were already struggling with mental health issues have essentially stopped taking their meds and come completely unglued. And I think the Me Too hysteria is just the current manifestation of that kind of Trump derangement syndrome. And I expect that in 2018 and beyond, as the president continues to win and as the cement dries on some of these victories and it becomes clear that there's some real permanent change that has been enacted, I think, it's going to take some other forms, this derangement. And I think we may look back wistfully on the hashtag Me Too movement and say, gosh, if it was only just that crazy at this point. So buckle up.
Well, you do have to compliment the liberals on their ability to come up with these fantastic negative things that they say about anything that Trump does. I mean, it doesn't matter how positive the action or the words that Trump speaks, the liberals can change it around to be something nasty.
All true. Number 5 is the slow disintegration of Turkey. And I don't think this is getting as much press attention as it should. This was the model Muslim country for many, many years and is still on a path, although right now it looks like Europe is resisting, but they were on a path to joining the European Union. And they would be the first majority Muslim country to join the EU. And of course, the way the EU's rules work is that allows free movement of people and goods. And so I think there's growing concern about the idea of Turkey joining. But under Erdogan, this country has taken a sharp Islamicist turn. And there have been mass arrests. I mean, really underreported that somewhere north of 100,000 people have been arrested in Turkey. Journalists, lawyers, teachers, opposition leaders. Basically, it's become a one-party state, and it has these vast prisons holding its opponents, essentially. And this is, while it may not look that different than a lot of other Middle Eastern countries, that's not the way that Turkey used to look. And it wasn't so long ago that there were exchange programs. I remember some of my own colleagues going to Turkey on exchange programs. But this is not the Turkey of today, and it's getting worse. And we have a base of operations, a military base of operations in Turkey, and I think that's forcing us to look the other way on things that we shouldn't be looking the other way on in order to maintain that relationship. And again, it goes to my point about how as we don't need to be involved in the Mideast, that base in Turkey becomes a lot less critical too, and it frees us up to criticize that regime in a way that I think that we should be. We need to get that base out of there, one way or the other, and I think we need to begin to disengage from Turkey because it's not going in a positive direction. And there's no doubt that there's torture going on in those prisons, and I wouldn't be surprised if there's obviously indiscriminate murder. I mean, I've seen enough reports of opposition leaders, Kurds and others being murdered, but this is a dictatorship, and it's not being recognized as such. And to watch a country that had a few decades tradition of democratic rule fall back into a dictatorship is a sad state of affairs for Turkey, and it doesn't make a strong argument for the Muslim world. Number 6, the independent movements in Europe, whether it's Brexit or Catalonia trying to break away from Spain, or the 3 Eastern Bloc countries that I mentioned before, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Poland, all refusing to admit migrants, even though the EU is trying to pressure them to do that. There are strong movements for independence in Europe, and I don't believe that that is going to diminish as we go forward. So it's not necessarily a story singular to 2017. Brexit started in 2016, but I think we saw it ramp up in 2017, and I expect that this issue is not going away going into 2018. Number 7, the mainstream media's implosion. They were apoplectic at the end of the 2016 election because of how impotent it was clearly established. They were to stop Trump's election. But I don't think they got the message, and I think they thought that they had the power to pound away at this guy and this phony Russian narrative, and that they could dislodge him from power or separate him from his base. That's the reason they run those stupid polls, constantly trying to tell you that his approval ratings are in the basement, is they're trying to separate Trump from his base. Only a failure to execute on immigration can actually do that. But, I mean, they've run out of hair to pull. They're all bald to a person in the mainstream media, and they have essentially proven to be completely impotent. Once again, for a second year running, they have not stopped the president. He has only grown stronger and accomplished more in spite of, the 90 to 90%, 95% negative press coverage of his administration. They are essentially like 1,000 chihuahuas latched onto this guy, but he just fights on.
Well, as some of them get taken out with these sexual allegations, at least there are less of them.
And they just get replaced with others. It's not like these people are being fired or being replaced with conservatives in their newsrooms. Number 8, the growing surveillance state. I think we've gotten a lot of information this year that should add to our concerns about the kind of information that large, super large corporations, mega corporations, and the government collect about us. Stories, for instance, about Apple slowing down their old phones, the fact that FISA warrants might have been used to monitor the Trump campaign. I saw this story the other day, maybe you all caught it, about the Netflix customer who was binge watching some show. I can't remember what the show was, but it was a rather depressing show. And after 12 hours of that, Netflix contacted him to find out if he was okay. So they had algorithms that let them know when people are doing things that depressed people do, and out of a concern for his safety, they specifically contacted him. Now, aside from the fact that he told that story because he thought it was wonderful they cared about him, I think you're getting a window into how much you're being observed and monitored when something like that can happen. Facebook decided that they were going to be the arbiters of what fake news was, and so they began a program of essentially filtering out news that they deemed to be fake, which essentially was right-wing news they didn't like. Now, it backfired on them because they had to stop the program because it turned out that when articles got labeled fake news, it actually attracted more eyeballs from people because they're smarter than Facebook. But still, to wield that kind of power is, I think, the thing to observe. And lastly, the Twitter purging that has been going on all year long, where Twitter has simply been purging people who they disagree with politically, claiming that they're getting rid of hate speech, but leaving all sorts of liberals who say very hateful things, they're leaving them on Twitter. So it's obviously a lie and just meant to purge certain people on the political spectrum and to curtail free speech. Take all of those stories together, and I think we have a growing problem with the way that social media is used to monitor and control us. And at some point, this is going to have to be confronted.
So do you think they will kick Trump off of Twitter?
Well, they can't afford to kick, because that would be the end. So many people would follow Trump off of Twitter. He's just too big a user at 40 million followers. I'm sure they'd love to, but he's too important to their bottom line. Lastly, I would put number 9 as the mass shooting at Mandalay Bay. Only because that investigation has gone dark, and the FBI has announced that it may take up to a year before they release their report on what happened. And this is, of all the places for a mass shooting to take place, this is the most surveilled place in America, other than maybe Washington, D.C. You know there are cameras on everywhere in Mandalay Bay, and that nearly every step that this shooter took, and nearly every victim of the shooting, is caught on camera. And yet, we haven't seen any of those videos. And I don't know whether there's a nefarious story behind all of this, but I find it troubling that a mass shooting, and we actually have seen this in the Florida, the gay nightclub and others, is authorities are very slow to divulge critical information about these shootings. It's almost as if it's a deliberate strategy to wait until the public has moved on and then to release the information that it was a terrorist or somebody with terrorist ties, because they figure at that point it's a small story. It's not white hot at the time. So all of the terrorist connections that came out about the guy in Florida, we didn't find out about until weeks, if not months later. And I think that's a purposeful decision by authorities to try to delay the release of negative information so it has less impact. And so that it's, when 50 to 100 people have been killed and anger is white hot and people find out in that moment that somebody has ISIS ties or terrorist ties, that can be a hell of a political motivator to get certain things done. But if you can delay that information out a few weeks or months, it kind of blunts the political will, if you will. I mean, we've known some of these terrorist attacks that have occurred, the attempted bombings and this truck that ran over some people on the bike lane in New York. It's been clear from a number of these events that they are products of chain migration. They have Muslim connections, and yet there's this strong desire among elites in our society to downplay that so that we don't draw the appropriate conclusions from it. Doris and I saw All the Money in the World this week, which is the movie will probably go down in Hollywood lore as being famous for the fact that at one time it starred Kevin Spacey, but because his whole life imploded around sex scandals, he was replaced after shooting was already done. And about a month before the movie was going to be released, he was replaced with Christopher Plummer, and the director, Ridley Scott, went and spent 10 days reshooting all of those scenes with Mr. Getty and Christopher Plummer replacing him. And actually, when I was watching the movie, that's the thing I kept thinking. I was like counting all the scenes and I thought maybe he had a much smaller role. But actually, there are a number of scenes that have J. Paul Getty in them, played by Christopher Plummer. And every time he came on the screen, I was kind of looking to see how expensive I thought that scene was, like how many other actors are in it, how much of a background is, because I thought maybe they would have tried to do some cheats and maybe just get him in close-up. And they actually did. There were a couple of shots, faraway shots, establishing shots of Mr. Getty kind of walking back into the house that I could tell were still Kevin Spacey and not Christopher Plummer, because it was a much more expensive shot, and they decided not to redo that. But still, he was in a lot of it. And then that was a really expensive reshoot. All for a movie that I think is just basically probably forgettable. I don't think anybody's going to be talking about this movie in a year.
Oh, I disagree with you there. First of all, your background in film study is showing, Matt, with looking for those things. So most of you know that Getty was insanely wealthy, but he had this perverse sense of priorities. He spent his days watching the stock market ticker tape and acquiring precious art. So I did find the story of the kidnapping interesting. He refuses to pay his grandson's ransom, citing it would inspire future kidnappings. But Plummer's acting was splendid, and although 30 minutes could have been cut out of the middle of the film, I would give All the Money in the World an A-. I think will be popular, and I'll remember it a year from now.
Yeah, my grade would be lower. I mean, there's nothing particularly wrong with the film. It just doesn't have... Doris and I were talking about this when it finished. It's essentially a movie about a kidnapping and about an actual event that took place. And that's interesting, but that could be a TV movie. In order to make it kind of a feature film, they decided they were going to include these scenes with Mr. Getty in which he kind of talks about money and wealth. And so they wrap this film in some platitudes and some what they think are some deep thoughts about the effect of money on people. But I didn't think it was that effective, and it doesn't necessarily increase the magnitude or the impact of the film. The kidnapping is the story, and that's interesting enough. I just don't think this is the kind of film that anybody's going to consider a classic, or that is going to be the kind of thing people are going to say, oh, you didn't see that movie? Someday you need to see that movie. And I think if you run across it on cable, you won't be disappointed. It'll hold your attention, and like I said, it is the retelling basically of a true story, a real kidnapping that occurred. But I just don't think there's much there as far as gravitas from the movie.
Well, won't you remember, though, that memorable line when Getty was asked, how much more money do you need? And he said...
Right. Well, I think he said, he was talking about how unsure he felt his finances were because of instability in the Mideast. And the other character, played by Mark Wahlberg, asks him, how much money would it take for you to feel secure? And his answer was, more. That's about all the time that we have for this week. This is our final episode of 2017. Thank you so much for being a listener. You can find past episodes on iTunes, SoundCloud, Stitcher, Pocket Cast, and YouTube. Please share us with a friend so that we can grow this audience. This is a labor of love, but we need to grow. Trump supporters, congratulations on a successful 2017. You are not alone. Goodbye, Doris.
Goodbye, Matt.